Okay, 100% test coverage, I think is kind of a panacea. That's kind of a target that can never quite be reached, but you can get as close to it as possible because there'll always be something that's not covered, but you should try. And how frequently are they done? Generally, it depends on what stage of development you are. And if you're testing on which branch, if you're testing on feature branch or an individual branch, in our regression suites that are done on prod, they're actually done several times a day, depending on the project, 2 to 4 times a day. And the whole idea behind that is we want to catch any issue, any problem before the client does. So you can do it generally in the development environment, basically once a week or once every few days when development is ready, when there's a commit. And like I said, in regression sets, several times a day. So if there's a problem, if there's an issue, then we know it before the client does, and we can fix it before the client ever knows anything was wrong. As I'm not really a performance testing person, I can let one of the other panelists handle a performance testing question.
Yeah, I can take that. It's very general. It depends on what you're testing, right? It could be a database performance. It could be a API performance. It could be a web application user experience performance. So each of these will have different indices, but it's always based on time, right? So that's my take on it. So if you're going to focus on database performance, you'd look for optimizations in terms of indexing or using multiple read replica caching, those kind of aspects, to improve the performance over there. Web performance I already covered in my talk. API, same way, see where there are opportunities for horizontal or vertical scaling, but it's always based off of time.
I believe I can give an example of reducing the test data preparation time. At this moment, I'm assigned to Port of Rotterdam. And at this moment, we are working on several applications for agents in order to plan a ship coming into the harbor of Rotterdam, etc., etc. And one piece of the functionality was the submission of a form, and the other piece of functionality was the viewing of a form. And I used mock data to test the viewing of that form by just one time submitting one and then check out the request that is being sent and the responses coming back, and then put that as test data within the test. And then if you want to take another step forward, you can maybe create builders in your code to make your test data more dynamic. So, for example, change in several labels or values. So that's only one way of reducing the time of setting test data. Maybe
one thing you can do is there are some tools out there which will help, and I'm not affiliated with any of these tools, so I can speak freely. But there are tools out there that will take real data and they will do things like subsetting. They will do things like randomizing. You've got to be very careful with test data. So what the lazy thing is, you grab some production data and you have some human try and make it generic. The danger is you're going to have personal information and suddenly you've got a GDPR violation. And so you can be very, very, very careful with data. Don't let people put production data in a testing tool or any kind of data system, because once it's there, it's hard to get rid of. And if it's in Git or Subversion or any source control tool, you may never get rid of the thing. So be really careful with data. It's a huge liability. But there are tools that can safely take production data and they can build rules where they'll take your production data and systematically make it generic. They'll subset it to only 10%. They'll do anonymizing. And once you build those rules, you can save the rules and you can take new updates from your system, live systems, and automatically turn that into test data. And in fact, you could even put that into a CI or pipeline potentially as well. So you could have DevOps driven data. So the key is if data is really important for your testing, you can have it be derived off your production data in a systematic and completely automated way. And there are tools that do that today. The one I know of is called DataProf. I think it's a German company. And I'm sure if you search around, there's others as well.
So one of the big things that I really like to try and do is, and I think, Adam, this goes along a lot with what you were talking about, is being very specific about what data you want. I've seen, as Adam, as you mentioned, a lot of organizations just take prod data, say, all right, well, this is what we need to use because this is all that we have. And that can take an incredible amount of time to load, ignoring all the security and anything else. So one of the things I really like to do is for every single test I have, I like to identify exactly the data that I need, no more, no less, because I don't want to have to load a few terabytes or even a few gigs or megs of data if I just want to run one test. And that can greatly speed things up, but it is difficult. You really need to understand what it is you're testing so you can select exactly the data that you need in order to exercise your system. And this becomes even more important if you're doing automation, because if you have other data that's in the system, it can really negatively impact your tests because your automation only knows what you programmed it, and having other bad data in there can be really detrimental. Which means you need more time up front, but it really is going to speed up your tests and make them a lot easier if you've done all that kind of beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have one more addition, because bottom line, it always depends on the context you're working in, right? And whether you're working with sensitive data or not, and also exactly what was told before, determine what kind of data you need in order to use that for an automated test. And tools like DataProf can really help to anonymize data, of course. But I think it's also a very expensive tool to use. So you would only use that in that scenarios where it's really necessary, right? You want to make if you're testing with conditions, also think about, okay, do we really have to test this end to end, or can I push this down towards unit integration tests where it's also possible to maybe more make the dependency smaller, make the test data smaller, and speed up the process.
I actually think that's a really interesting question. One of the points that I don't think I got to make earlier when I was talking about continuous testing is that continuous testing and as an extension, even DevOps, does not mean everything has to be automated. There's plenty of room for manual testing. The whole point of DevOps is to automate the deployment, automate the tests, automate the results that you're getting back. But there's absolutely room for you to perform whatever manual tests that you need, as long as those test results are fed back into the system so that they can be automatically reported out and continue to act as gates. So I do think that you can do it very successfully with DevOps. I've seen this done. You just need to make sure the information is flowed back and that you've set up your system in a correct fashion. We've kind of done this just through manual triggers. Have manual QA folks go in, they've said, I'm done testing, these are my results. Excuse me. Kind of click the go or the no-go button for a pass-fail, so the code can move on to the next stage.
Yes, I would like to say I completely agree with Max. Charter-based test exploration goes very well with DevOps. Yeah, when we say automate everything, that basically means make sure that you have a lot of automated tests that can be run like right after a commit. But very definitely testing, like manual testing, observation-based exploratory testing, running charters set for a specific amount of time are definitely a good part of DevOps and definitely should be done. Automation is an answer, but it's not always the answer. But for DevOps, it's definitely a very good answer, is what I'll add.
I think also automation is not the complete answer, but automation, if you can automate the mundane and the routine, you give people more time to do the interesting and the unusual and the kind of the metaphysical aspects of testing. I mean, if you make a test to follow a script, you're making a human be a robot. We should have robots do what robots do and then give the humans time to do what humans do. So I think it's just changing our expectations. Automation is part of the answer, is right.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I totally agree. I mean, we don't get rid of manual testing. I mean, that's where the knowledge comes into play in terms of like your experts that are actually looking at the system and understanding how to do that exploratory testing. I will say, back in the day when we used to do mobile testing, we did use some tools around, we talked about fuzz testing, right? There are automation tools that will do fuzz testing, which is kind of a random sort of set of tests on an application. You're not really controlling that. It actually is doing it for you. I will say I've had mixed results with fuzz testing, but there is an automation component that you could introduce fuzz testing.
The one thing that's interesting is API testing, because we talk about human testing because the end user is a human. When you're dealing with API testing where the end user is a computer, I don't know, can you get 100% automation? Do you need humans? I mean, you need humans to design the test to make sure you're not missing security, performance, all the stuff I think I talked about earlier. But actually, with APIs, is that the one area where we could 100% automate, or is that still not realistic? I'm just curious.
I think it depends. With automation, you always determine the scenarios up front, right? It's always the scenarios that you expect. And
right.
With exploratory testing and manual testing, you might find scenarios that are unexpected. I think that's the big difference in the added value of both. And I think still with API testing, you can cover all kinds of responses you can get back. But I think it's always good to ask the question whether scenarios are relevant. Can we actually expect a response like 403 or something else in reality? So yeah, it's always good to ask the questions, right?
But yeah, it's interesting that I think you're right. But I think when people talk about exploratory testing and writing charters, they don't ever talk about. I've never heard people talk about APIs and writing a charter, but it makes a lot of sense. Here's the API endpoint. Do some testing. Try different payloads. See what happens. Look at the results. But I think people think of charters. They think of UI, mobile, desktop, whatever, big web, because that's what we're thinking. But you're absolutely right. There is actually a very, I think, good case to doing charters for APIs.
Well, I think the other difference for APIs.
Depends who the user is, right? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, I only wanted to say depends who the user is, right? Because that's what you're going for with the charters. But go ahead, Max.
Well, I don't disagree about having charters, but I think it's interesting because for API tests, you're working with a limited set. And there's not just absolutely anything that you can do. I mean, it's very data driven. Whereas if you're thinking about the UI, it's not a finite list of activities that you have. And I think that's really kind of the main difference as to why, yeah, you probably could automate everything to the API, but then you need to be looking at your combinatorics and whittling things down. So I don't know. I don't actually think there's needed room for exploratory testing within the API, assuming that you have properly understood what the workflows are and what the possible data sets are.
Yeah, I think what Anas is saying is that there's a good chance that in your test design there'll be a flaw. You'll take shortcuts, and it's only when someone plays around randomly with the API Or so maybe the end user is a developer. Pretend I'm a developer using the Google Maps API, and what would I want to do with it, as opposed to running a unit test framework that just simply calls every API once. So if I put my mind in the shoes of a developer using the API, I might ask different questions than if I'm thinking very much as a pure tester, like API 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you might think about, well, this API might technically work, but it doesn't give me the data that I need. So it's almost like a usability testing of an API.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I agree with that. But I mean, to me, that kind of is what distinguishes testers from developers. Is that's kind of why we're going and building out our test plans and thinking about these things, because we should be putting on the persona of whatever user that's actually going to be interacting with the system.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that in so many companies, to avoid this type of gap, they send us toys or send us into the field. So I remember when I was working with a big retail company, they usually send us the scales, the different handhelds to check that the pricing or how we are capturing the pricing. Even though in the financial industry, I remember that I went to some data center and we happened to truly an ATM, where we were testing and enter the transaction, testing that wherever that if we need to swipe the credit card is working properly. So I think that we can avoid that, even though with using some of the usability testing technique that is having interviews with even though the fields engineers and try to see what is the day by day in their case. And we can incorporate that in our end-to-end flows to see that, okay, if they were gonna request some items, so how they are doing. So they use the handheld and put some code in the handheld. So how this code is go to the pricing team and or the item teams, and how all the end-to-end flow started to begin until the end. That could be, in this case, I was working in the backroom, so store backroom. So how from the handheld, the item that they were requesting is coming on through my system and understand what is the different dependencies and how the information was flowing, how affect the tax team, how affects the different teams. So I think that is good practice that they send us on, or send us the toys that we need to start to get that experience.
One thing I would just say in general, and I think of software, a field service engineer can be anyone in support. Your support people know your system really well. They're dealing with your real customers. Don't put your support people in a separate room, living separately. Make your developers do support for a day. Make your, obviously pre-pandemic, make your developers take your support people out for coffee. Right now do a virtual happy hour. But for whatever reason, make sure you encourage close socialization and communication between people doing support, people doing testing, people doing development. Because you always think of DevOps and test ops, but support ops, think of the support people. That's your shift right testing. They know the system really well. They are frontline human-based monitoring. So I think it's an underutilized resource in general.
Yes, I have some experience with visual regression automation. It basically takes a lot of practice and a lot of skill with the visual regression tool, because in my experience, there were simply too many GIFs. Too many diffs. You can take for example, like the exemplar image, whether it be from like a tool like InVision or XD or Zeppelin or anything like that, and you take it to the website image. In my experience, there were simply too many diffs. It all looks wrong. So you really have to cut down and try and test, just for example, headers, test like a main part, test sidebars. You have to really be careful because you'll get far too many, like I said, far too many diffs and it all looks wrong. And as for tools, there is a tool like Diffie, which I think is a paid tool. And Backstop.js is another very good tool, but you have to experiment and practice so you can cut down on the number of diffs you see.
I've not used any of these tools, but two other tools you could look at would be ZapTest, and it's quite an expensive service. There's another one called Applitools. So Applitools and ZapTest will be two people could look at.
Yeah, I have experience with the last one with Applitools, and a few years ago I was working in a team, and actually another team was working on the CMS system, so they really had to visually check a lot of stuff, and they used Applitools, and I think you have to pay per screenshot, right? So you have a base, and then you check what the difference is, obviously, and they did thousands and thousands of screenshots per week, so it can really become very expensive for the company. So I believe it's again, ask yourself, what do you want to achieve? What do you need to check? Maybe it's sufficient to maybe have a style sheet with a standard button or a standard pieces of the front end that you might test on a number of browsers, for example, and then that's about it. But of course, it depends what the goal is. But keep in mind that it can be very expensive, and also the effort for the automated tester as well, because you always have to click through the screenshots. Oh, what are the diffs? Are they okay or not okay? And it's really tiresome as well. not really fun to do.
Yeah, Applitools is very expensive. The one I know that one of our clients is a hospital in the United States, and they moved all their applications to Citrix, so all their automation broke because all their Selenium, all their Test Complete, all their stuff broke, and they use ZapTest. So ZapTest, I know the company. I have no affiliation with them. I just see them at conferences. They have a relatively low-cost tool that you can buy versus having to rent, like Applitools, and they can do visual testing. I know that the hospitals had some success with that. But and in Citrix, you have no choice because it's just a GIF effectively being rendered. So but feel free to try it out.
And Backstop.js is free, I'll add.
Free is always better, right?
Often.
Not always, but often.
I'm an open source.
True. Right.
Short answer: shell script, Python, Alteryx. I've been using this lately to read the log file and then apply some mining code. So with Alteryx tool. So, but most likely you can do Python or R or shell script. So.
Well, if I can take this early start, I think one of the big parameters is you have to go to coverage, like how close is your coverage to 100%. Like I said, you